it wasn't supposed to be forever. At least, that's what I told myself when I signed that lease, pen flying across the paper. 6 months, just enough time to save a little bit of money, get my bearings, and then move on to somewhere better. Somehow though, 6 months then turned into 8, then 9, and before I knew it, I was watching the first snow of the season drift lazily past my window. The little house sat at the edge of this cat-ass neighborhood, faded paint from beige to gray. It didn't scream welcome, but it didn't scream run either, which was more than I could say for some of the other places that I'd toured. Real crazy neighborhoods, barking dogs, drug deals, discharged firearms in the middle of the night, the whole thing. This house was really cold in the winter. I'm talking bone cold. That little space heater in my bedroom could only do so much, and I wasn't about to crank up the electric bill on that central heating for a place that I didn't even like that much. On top of that, the place was drafty as hell. I'd be paying the heat to the street. Most evenings, I would come home from the restaurant, bundle myself up in a blanket, and just wait for the hours to tick by. It was lonely, but there was a rhythm to it. This quiet monotony that I found almost comforting. Until the fireplace started calling to me. Not literally, of course, though in hindsight, I kind of wish it had. At least then, I'd have the excuse to get the hell out of there. No, it was just the fireplace. One of the features in the house that could have made it feel warm, cozy, even inviting. It would sit there unused though, blackened interior, mocking me every time I walked past. Finally, on one particular bitter evening, I broke. I dialed Marty, my landlord, and asked about it. His voice was pretty gravelly, throat lubed up with a lifetime of cheap smokes and cheap whiskey as well. The hearth, yeah, it's usable. Just needs a little inspection first. Liability and all that, you know. Can't have tenants burning the place down. Also gotta make sure the chimney is working. The hearth? Old guy shit. We settled on Friday. I expected to see him send some kind of professional, a chimney sweep or somebody with tools in a uniform. Instead, it was Marty himself who showed up. This big lumbering frame silhouetted against the pale winter sky. He didn't knock and I couldn't believe it. It was more of a tap tap tap, just enough to make his presence known. When I opened the door, his face split into a wide grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, kiddo," he said, brushing past me into the house. "Let's see what you got here." Unbelievable. I stood there standing for just a moment, cold air rushing in from the open door before I closed it and then followed him into the living room. He was already crouched in front of the fireplace, head tilted at an angle as he peered inside. His coat smelled faintly of mildew, and when he spoke again, his voice carried this strange, almost mocking tone. "Yeah, I've cleaned a few of these in my time. We don't need a pro. Saved myself a fortune doing stuff like this. Sure, you know how it is." He winked at me. "Landlord stuff. Top shelf asshole. Cheap asshole." I didn't, but I just nodded anyway. Something about him being here just put me on edge, though I couldn't really say why. Maybe it was just the way he moved. Slow, just obnoxiously slow. Like he had all the time in the world to do whatever it was he was doing. Or maybe it might have been the way his eyes lingered on things, darting from the fireplace to the walls to the hallway that led to the bedrooms. It took me a few times to realize he was actually inspecting the place, almost like he was looking for something. "So, you like it here?" he asked suddenly. Tone light and conversational, but there was something in his gaze that just made my skin crawl. "Yeah, it's fine," I replied. "Just a temporary thing, but it does suit me. This winter is coming right through the walls." "Temporary, huh?" he chuckled. "Funny how temporary has a way of sticking around." And then scratched his ass and went back to the chimney. I stood in the living room, arms crossed, watching as Marty ran his fingers along that soot-stained brick inside the fireplace. He muttered something under his breath, then leaned back on his heels to peer up the chimney. "Not bad. You can actually see the color through that thing," he said. "Could use a little work, but it'll do." Just need to grab my tools. I know what you're thinking. What kind of gobbledygook is coming out of Marty? Will it do? Does it need work? I've never heard a person be more unclear, so I just waited to see what he was gonna do. He didn't ask if I had plans or if this was a good time. He just lumbered back to his car, returning a few moments later with his plastic tote filled with brushes and what looked like a flashlight wrapped in duct tape. He plopped it all onto my coffee table without a second thought, and I winced as the edge of the tote scraped the surface. "Hope you don't mind me making myself at home," he said. The way his teeth caught the light made me think about broken tombstones, yellow ones at that. After all, it's my house, you know? I quickly told myself to relax. It's a chimney inspection, something he was technically obligated to do. Hell, it was for my safety. And yet every time this guy moved, I felt my muscles tense, as if bracing for some kind of unseen blow. Marty started tinkering with the fireplace, unscrewing a panel and scraping at the buildup inside. After a few minutes, he straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and eyes darted back toward the hallway. "Anyone else here?" I shook my head. "This house, man, used to see a lot of people walking around all the time," he said, shaking his head. "Got some stories. You know, I used to live here." I blinked, caught off guard. "You did?" "Oh yeah, long before you came along, 10 years ago maybe. Had this whole place fixed up nice. Well, as nice as this dump can get." Of course, it was a different crowd back then. The kind of people you wouldn't think twice about putting a hole in the wall or throwing a party that lasted 3 days long. Ragers, bingers, total blowouts. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but the thought of Marty living here, walking these same floors, sleeping in one of the bedrooms, almost made me laugh. He must have noticed the flicker of amusement in my eyes because his grin came back. "Yeah, this old place has seen some things. You ever wonder about the tenants before you? What they were like? What they left behind? Where they went?" Not really," I said. "I just needed a place to stay, that's all." Marty hummed to himself thoughtfully, set his tools aside, then wandered toward the spare bedroom. "You mind if I take a look around and, it just brings back old memories." Before I could even answer, he was already halfway down the hall. "Hey, I called after him. "The fireplace?" "In a minute," he shouted back. "Just want to check something out." I stood there frozen, torn between following him and just staying put. Marty moved throughout the house. A few minutes later, he emerged from the spare bedroom, holding one of my framed photos. It was a candid shot of me and my sister at the beach, laughing through a sunburn. "You," he said, holding it up. "This your sister?" "Yeah," I said, snatching it from his hands. "And I'd really appreciate it if you didn't go through my stuff." "Relax," he said. "I wasn't snooping, just reminiscing. You know, I used to have a little girl, about your age actually." I stared at him, unsure of how to even respond to that. He smiled again, but this time it didn't feel like a smile at all. It was more predatory, something that made me want to crawl out of my skin. "Anyway," he said, clapping his hands together, "back to that chimney." He headed back to the living room, but I couldn't shake whatever was happening. I just hovered near the hallway, watching as Marty half-heartedly scrubbed at the fireplace. Occasionally he would glance over his shoulder, but never said anything else. When he finally spoke again, his voice was now low and creepy. You got a boyfriend?" "What?" I asked. "A boyfriend," he repeated. "Somebody to keep you company in this big empty house. Seems like you get a little lonely." "That's really none of your business," I said. Marty chuckled. "We're just making conversation, no need to get snippy. Better be careful. People might start thinking you're a bitch," he said through that yellow smile. I stepped back and put more distance between us now. "You almost done, dude?" "Almost," he said, but he wasn't looking at the fireplace anymore. He was looking at me, up and down. "You know, I've always had a soft spot for girls like you. Independent, feisty." My throat tightened and I took another step back. "All right, I think you should leave." "Oh, come on," he said. "I'm just joking around, lighten up a little bit." He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans once more, and took a step toward me. My instinct screamed to run, but instead I turned and bolted back into my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were trembling as I slid the lock into place, and for a moment I just stood there, listening to the sound of Marty's footsteps in the hallway. "Hey," he called out. His voice was muffled through the door though. "You know I got a key, right? Don't make me use it." I didn't answer, heart racing, each beat of a drum roll in my ears. I grabbed my phone and dialed the first number that came to mind, Alice.
"Hello?"
"Alice," I whispered. "You need to come over right now, please. Bring Jake."
"What? Why? What's going on?"
"Just do it. Just do it, please." There was another long pause, and then she said,
"We're on our way."
Marty must have heard me because he laughed, and that sound sent chills down my spine. "Calling for reinforcements, huh? Smart girl." He scraped something out on the other side of the door. "I used to live here, dummy. I know a million ways to get inside that room you're in." I stayed silent, clutching the phone like a lifeline. After a few minutes, I heard him moving around again, gathering his tools and muttering something to himself. "Well, this has been fun," he said. "Fireplace is all set. Enjoy. Stay warm." I waited until I heard the front door open and then close, followed by the rumble of his car engine. Even then, I remained still, staying locked in my room waiting for Alice and Jake to arrive. Doing anything else seemed completely insane to me. I stayed there until I heard Alice and Jake pull up. Her old Honda, with the engine humming, came to a stop in the driveway. I peered through the blinds and watched them climb out, Jake already scanning the house with one hand in his jacket pocket. Gun guy. I hurried to the front door, unlocking it, practically pulling them inside before I could say another word. They were going to get me out of this. "The hell happened?" Alice asked. "He was here," I said. "Marty, the landlord. He came over to clean the fireplace, but he didn't. He just walked around, looked at my stuff, asked questions, weird questions. Then he tried to..." I stopped. He said he had a key to my room. Jake was looking around. "Is he still here?" "No, he left, but it was awful." Alice put a hand on my arm and said, "You're not staying here anymore. No way." "Yeah, I already decided that," I responded. I can't. I don't even care about breaking the lease." "We'll help you pack," Jake said. "Where are you going to stay?" With you, if that's okay." "Of course it's okay," Alice said. "You're not going to be here alone, especially not after this." We started packing right then and there, grabbing clothes, important documents, and anything I couldn't bear to leave behind. That house was different now, like all of it was dangerous. Every creak of the floorboards was now going to make me jump. I kept catching myself glancing out the windows, expecting Marty's face to appear on the other side of that glass. By the time the last box was in Alice's car, it was past midnight. The temperature had dropped even further. My breath fogged in the air as I turned to lock the front door, hands still shaking as I slid the key into the lock. Then I heard the crunch of tires on snow. I turned to see Marty's truck idling at the end of the driveway, silhouette visible behind the wheel. For a moment, he just sat there, watching us, headlights casting long shadows across the yard. "What the hell does he want now?" Alice muttered. Jake then stepped forward, placing himself between us and the truck. "Get in the car," he said. I hesitated, feet frozen to the ground, but then Marty opened up the door and stepped out. His boots were crunching against the snow as he walked toward us. "Moving out already, huh?" he called out. "I am." He stopped a few feet away. His hands were in his pockets. "You know, breaking that lease is going to cost you 3 months' rent, minimum. Sure you want to do that?" "I don't care. You're not going to threaten me into staying here." Marty then tilted his head just like he'd done when he was looking up the chimney. "Threaten you? Come on now, I was just trying to help. You're the one making a big deal out of nothing." "Nothing," I snapped. "You went through my things. You asked me disgusting questions and tried to scare me. That's not nothing." He just shrugged. "You're overreacting, but hey, you want to leave, that's your choice. Just know you're walking away from a great deal." "If you ever come near me again, I'm calling the police, and I'll tell them everything. And I'll do way worse than that," Jake added. Marty's smile then faltered for a split second before he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Have a good life." He then turned around and walked back to his truck. I watched as he climbed in and drove away, taillights disappearing off into the night. The three of us just stood there in the freezing cold, tension lingering long after he was gone. Finally, Alice put a hand on my shoulder. "Hey, let's get out of here," she said softly. That night I moved in with Jake and Alice, sleeping on their couch for the next few weeks. Search for a new place. Moving in the dead of winter was not easy, but it was better than staying in that house, constantly looking over my shoulder. I never saw Marty again, thankfully, but every once in a while I would hear his name mentioned in passing. He owned half a dozen houses in the area, always renting them out to people who couldn't afford anything better. That guy's a predator, and he damn near got me. You want to hear a story about a landlord? Let me tell you about Jack Carlino. I still can't say his name out loud without feeling like my balls are going to rot off. Back in 1964, my father rented an apartment from him in Brooklyn. It was a second-floor walk-up in a building that should have been condemned 20 years prior. The windows rattled in their frames when the wind blew. The floorboards buckled. The electricity even flickered like some kind of cheap haunted house attraction. I was just a kid then, probably no older than 10 years old. And even then, I could tell that place was a dump. My older brother Teddy used to call it the Rat Palace. We would all laugh at that, except for, well, my dad. He wasn't much for those kind of jokes. There were 5 of us total crammed inside that apartment. My parents, me, Teddy, and our little sister Kate, who was only 5 at the time. We all shared one room. Kate and I in one bed, Teddy in another, while my parents slept in the living room on a pull-out couch that groaned like a dying day laborer every time they used it. Privacy was just this luxury that we couldn't afford. My dad worked these long shifts inside a dock warehouse, and my mom took office cleaning jobs to keep all of our asses covered. The apartment wasn't supposed to be permanent, just until we got on our feet, my dad would say. 6 months turned into a year, then a year stretched into 2. That's how it goes when you're barely scraping by. Time doesn't stop for you to catch up. No one does. Carlino was the kind of landlord who'd make you believe every horror story that you'd ever heard about slumlords was completely true. A real old-timey New York scumbag. He lived somewhere uptown in a nice brownstone, probably bought with the money he squeezed out of tenants like us, though I'd actually heard he had mafia money. I only saw him a few times, but I'll never forget the way he looked. He was short and thick, the face like an ugly mutt. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel small, like you weren't even worth the dirt on his shoes. The thing about the building that would make it unforgettable was the rats. They weren't those little kinds that you'd see in cartoons with beady little eyes. No, these were monsters. They had thick matted fur, tails like rope, and they moved in packs. Shit, they even kind of looked like Carlino, now that I think about it. Thick boys. You could hear them in the walls at night, scratching and squealing like pigs at the donut shop. Sometimes, if you were unlucky, you'd catch one scurrying across the kitchen floor, poking its head out of a cabinet. My mom screamed the first time she ever saw one, and after that, she just stopped screaming and started cursing. Everybody inside that building would complain about them, but Carlino didn't care. "What do you want me to do about it?" he'd say. "Rats are a part of a city living. You don't like it, move to the suburbs." He knew we all couldn't afford to leave. He knew we were trapped, and he used that to his advantage. Rent was due on the 1st, no exceptions. Late, he'd slap you with a fee. Too late, he'd threaten to evict you and slap you for real. I watched him backhand more than one tenant in our hallways. My dad called him a parasite, and I think he was on point. Carlino fed off people like us, people who didn't have the money or the power to fight back. But even a parasite can push too far. In fact, I believe it's in their nature. And Carlino, he didn't just push, he shoved and horse-kicked everybody in his way. He was like an apparition of New York, the city incarnate, a truly bad man who turned other people bad with him. The rats didn't just exist in the background of our lives, they were a constant gnawing presence. They partied in the wall, played dice under our feet, even scratched at the inside of our closet doors, as if testing our defenses. Teddy used to joke that they were trying to get their own apartment. At first, we just tried to live with them, setting up traps like mountain men, or leaving poison pellets tucked behind furniture. The traps caught nothing but air, and the poison just seemed to fatten them up. It was like they were thriving on our attempts to get rid of them, growing bolder with every hour. One night, I'll never forget it. I was lying in bed next to Kate, trying to block out all the sounds of scuttling underneath the floorboards. I was half asleep when I felt something heavy land on the blanket. My breath stopped dead like a Kennedy. Kate was snoring softly beside me, completely oblivious. I didn't dare move. My eyes were now fixed on the lump that was slowly creeping toward the pillow. It stopped inches from my face, its shape unmistakable in the moonlight. A rat, big as a taxi. I bolted upright and sent it flying off the bed. It didn't matter though. Others climbed up on the bedposts. Some fell out of the rafters. We were suddenly buried in the bastards. I fought them off as best I could, pushed them onto the floor, punched some across the room. Still, they crawled onto the sheets. Kate woke up screaming, and Teddy rushed in with a broom, shouting like a Catholic. He turned the lights on, and I could see them biting my sister, all over her legs and neck. They crawled up and down her little body, and my brother and I went into a flying rage. We knocked them all off and started punching, stomping, wrecking every rodent that failed to escape us. By the time my parents had finally come in, all the rats were gone, disappearing into the shadows as if they had never been there at all. Only evidence left behind was the blood on the walls and the bite marks all over Kate. That night, my dad stayed up with a baseball bat, sitting in the living room, jaw clenched so tight it looked like he might shatter. He didn't say a word, but the dark circles under his eyes the next morning said enough. We were all on edge. Teddy started sleeping with a flashlight and a kitchen knife under his pillow. Kate wouldn't go to bed unless my mom sat with her until she fell asleep, and me started to hate the nights. It felt like an invitation for the rats to come out and remind us who really owned the apartment. We weren't the only ones suffering though. I heard the neighbors complain constantly, whispering in the hallways about the infestation. Mrs. Gomez and 3B swore the rats had eaten through her pantry, tearing open bags of rice and flour, leaving droppings in their wake. Mr. Green in 1A claimed that he's seen one drag a slice of pizza across his kitchen floor, not once, but twice. He was the local pizzeria for the rat population. Everybody was angry, but nobody was brave enough to confront Carlino. No one except my dad. I was there the day my dad tried to talk to him. Carlino had come by to collect the rent, talking from behind his usual cigar. My dad handed over the envelope and said, "You gotta do something about these rats, Carlino. It's getting out of hand." He smirked. "Rats are part of the package, Joe. You don't like it, you can move. Bye-bye." "We can't afford to move," my dad said, "but you can afford to do your damn job." Carlino took the cigar out of his mouth and leaned in close. "Think I care about your problems? I own this building. You don't like how I run it, there's the door. But if you think you're staying here rent-free, you've got another thing coming." "I never said rent-free, I said rat-free." "Rats come with the rent package deal. Didn't we go over this?" He cut my father's cheek as he spoke, as if threatening to slap him. I remember watching the way my dad's fists would clench at his sides, and for a second, I thought he was going to hit him, but then he just stepped back and said, "You're going to regret this." Carlino laughed as he walked out. "See you next month." Things seemed to get worse after that. It was like the rats knew we were fighting back and decided to punish us for it. They'd chewed through some of the wires in the walls, causing the lights to flicker more than ever. It tore into our food, leaving teeth marks almost in everything. One even got into the bathroom, hiding behind the toilet and hissing when my mom tried to chase it out with a mop. It felt like we were under siege, trapped in a war that we couldn't win. And the rat shit, my God, it's the worst part about the fight. Shit everywhere. It's like fighting the dirty subway homeless. And then something happened that changed everything. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I was asleep when I heard Kate scream. And not the kind of scream you let out when you see a spider or stub your toe. This was a raw sound that ripped through the apartment, yanked me off the couch. My parents were already running to the room when I saw it. Kate was sitting up in bed, face pale as a sheet, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her legs were covered in blood, and the sheets around her were soaked with it too. And there on the floor was one of the rats. It was dead, body twisted and broken, but its teeth were still bared, and its fur was matted with blood. "They were on me," Kate sobbed, clutching at my mom. "They were biting me again." My dad didn't say a word. He grabbed the baseball bat and started smashing the floor, the walls, anything he could reach. Teddy and I stood frozen, watching as he let out a roar that didn't even sound human. My mom held Kate close, rocking her back and forth like she could will the nightmare away. But the damage was done. Kate had deep bites in her legs and neck. We had no choice but to take her to the hospital. This time it was far worse than before, probably because, well, I wasn't in there to protect her this time. The doctors said she was pretty lucky. The bites were bad, but the real danger was the infection. Kate ended up having a fever for days, her small body racked with chills and sweat. My mother didn't leave her side, and my dad still barely spoke a word. His face was just a mask of fury and guilt. Those hospital bills nearly broke us, but we didn't care. All that mattered was Kate was alive, struggling still every day. When we got back to the apartment that day, the first thing we see is Carlino in the hallway, talking to another tenant. My dad marched right up to him. "You're gonna pay for what happened." Carlino just sneered back at him. "Not my problem, whatever it is." My dad didn't hit him. He didn't yell. He just stared at him for a long moment and said, "You're nothing." And for the first time, Carlino didn't laugh back. We went home and that was that. Kate thankfully recovered, though she carried those scars on her legs and neck for the rest of her life. They weren't just physical scars either. Those rats had done something to her spirit, stealing a piece of her childhood that could never come back. She wouldn't play with her dolls anymore, wouldn't even sit on the floor unless my mom scrubbed it clean in front of her. She started having night terrors, waking up in the middle of the night screaming. That next year was a slow crawl of misery. We saved every penny, eating canned soup and day-old bread just to make rent, and put away just enough to dream of leaving. My dad would start taking these odd jobs on the weekends, cleaning gutters, hauling trash, anything he could find. My mom sewed clothes for a few spare bucks, working until her fingers bled. Even Teddy pitched in, working afternoons at a corner store, slipping his wages in the coffee can that we kept under the sink. It was endless, but we had a goal: to get out of that hellhole and leave Carlino and those rats behind. Finally, after 12 grueling months, we did it. We found a new place on the other side of the city. It wasn't much better, this tiny one-bedroom walk-up, but it was clean. No rats, no flickering lights, no smell of mildew hanging in the air. Moving day felt like waking up from this long nightmare. My dad just stood in the middle of the empty apartment, looking around like he couldn't quite believe it was even real. "We're done," he said. "We're finally done." And we were, or at least so I thought. A few months later, we went out to celebrate. My dad had gotten a small raise at work, and for the first time in over a year, we could afford to sit down at a restaurant. It was this dingy Italian joint with checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles. Kate was laughing. Teddy was teasing her about how much bread she could eat. For a moment, it felt like we were a normal family again. Then, my dad's face puckered up like he could smell the city dump. I followed his gaze across the room, and there he was, Jack Carlino, sitting at a corner table with a cigar in one hand, laughing loudly as he shoved a plate of lasagna in his mouth. My stomach twisted at the sight of him. I felt the mood shift at our table. My dad didn't say anything, but he didn't touch his food either. He just stared at Carlino, jaw tight, eyes dark. Teddy noticed too. He leaned in and whispered something to my dad, something I didn't hear. My dad nodded, just once, and then the two of them went back to eating like nothing had happened. We left the restaurant after dessert. The whole walk home was really quiet. Kate was asleep on my mom's shoulder, and Teddy kept glancing at my dad. When we got home, I went straight to bed. I don't know why, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of the front door creaking open. I lay there, listening to the footsteps that padded down the hallway, 2 sets of them. I crept out of bed and peeked into the living room, just in time to see my dad and Teddy slipping out into the night. They didn't see me, and I didn't follow. I just stood there, heart pounding until the door clicked shut behind him. A few hours later, I heard the door again, the shuffle of their boots on the floor, and the low murmur of their voices. I didn't get up this time. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to pretend I hadn't heard anything. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were full of rats. The next morning, my dad and Teddy were quiet. My dad sat at the table drinking coffee and reading the paper, like always. But I noticed his hands were shaking. Teddy looked pale, his eyes shadowed like he hadn't slept at all. And nobody said a word about the night before, and I didn't ask. 2 days later, a story broke. It was on the front page of the paper, right there in black and white. Man found dead in an alleyway. There was a picture of Carlino, his face bruised and swollen, his eyes staring blankly at the camera. The article said he'd been beaten to death, body discovered by a garbage collector early in the morning. No suspects, no witnesses. Just another statistic in a city that chewed people up and spit them out. I looked at my dad as he read the article. His face was stone, unreadable, but his hands were still shaking. Teddy sat across from him, staring at his plate, not eating anything. My mom was in the kitchen humming softly as she washed dishes, oblivious. No one was talking. No one said anything, but I don't think anybody needed to. Now, I don't know for sure what happened that night. Maybe my dad and Teddy just went for a walk and talked about old times and then came home. Or maybe they found Carlino in that alley and decided to finish what those rats had started. Maybe it was just all a coincidence, because in New York, there's a lot of those. I found the room in Aaron's house through one of those old school classified ads in the local newspaper. I still remember the small boxy font and that single line that caught my attention. Room for rent in spacious home. Affordable, quiet. Call Aaron. It was like the universe handed me this easy solution to what had been a very miserable few weeks of couch surfing after losing my last apartment. The address was in this decent suburb. It had cracked sidewalks and faded shutters, but still respectable enough. I called the number and spoke directly to Aaron. He sounded distracted, like I was interrupting something, but he agreed to show me the place that evening. The house was massive, sprawling like an old Victorian relic that had given up trying to keep up with appearances. The siding was peeling in long strips. The lawn looked like it had been through a war, and the driveway had cracks big enough to swallow a small dog. But the inside, it was nice. Hardwood floors, lots of windows, a kitchen big enough to host a Thanksgiving dinner. Aaron gave me the full tour, and I noticed immediately how little he seemed to care about impressing me. He spoke in these clipped sentences. His voice was gruff and low, like he had somewhere else to be. "All right, this is the room," he said, opening up a door near the end of the second floor hallway. It was simple but clean. Bed, dresser, a small little desk pushed up against the wall. The best part was the attached bathroom, all for me. No waiting in line for a shower, no awkward encounters with other tenants. With that, I was sold immediately. "How much?" I asked him. $550 a month, he said, leaning against the door frame. He had this way of looking at me that felt both casual and intense at the same time, like he was sizing me up for reasons I didn't quite understand. "That includes utilities. I don't want a lot of noise, no parties, clean up after yourself. Good with that?" I nodded, eager to agree with whatever rules he had enforced. That place was a steal, especially for a place that size. Aaron seemed satisfied, and with a grunt, he told me to get my stuff together and move in whenever I was ready. The first few months were smooth sailing. Aaron kept to himself, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet at times. He told me he worked a corporate job in the city, but never mentioned any specifics. He'd leave early in the morning, dressed in this rumpled suit, and come back late. His tie was undone, face lined with exhaustion. I didn't pry, and he wasn't unfriendly, exactly. But he had this way of brushing off conversation that made it clear he wasn't interested in all that small talk. Honestly, that arrangement suited me just fine. I had my space, he has his. Every other weekend, his two kids would come stay with him, a boy around 12 and a girl a few years younger than that. They were loud, laughter filling up the house, but honestly, it was a good kind of noise. It made that place feel alive. Even with the kids around though, there was just something strange about this house, and I don't really know how else to explain that to you. Maybe it was the way the floors creaked at night, sounds echoing down those empty hallways. Or maybe the shadows that seemed to deepen in certain corners, like they were hiding something. Once, I could have swore that I heard somebody whispering outside of my door in the middle of the night, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. I chalked it up to my imagination, paranoia that comes with living inside a new place. Aaron himself added to the weirdness though. He was so hard to read. His moods would shift like the weather. Some days he'd nod at me as I passed him in the kitchen, offering a grunt of acknowledgement. Other days, he didn't even seem to notice that I exist. I figured he was just one of those guys who preferred solitude. He didn't seem to have many friends, and the only visitors he ever had were his kids. Occasionally, a woman I assumed would be his ex-wife, though they never spoke more than a few words to one another. I couldn't complain though. The rent's cheap, house is comfortable, and Aaron left me alone. I told myself that whatever these weird vibes were that I was picking up on was just in my head. After all, I wasn't in any kind of position to be very picky. Even then though, there was still a small part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole setup just didn't add up. A few months later, things started to feel truly off. Aaron, obviously, had always been very distant, but now he was downright elusive. Weeks would go by without me even seeing him, even though his car was still in the driveway every single morning. The house seemed to feel hollow without him. Creaks, groans, that old structure amplified by his absence. On the rare occasions I did catch a glimpse of him, he would look rough, like he hadn't slept in days. Shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot. There was also this faint smell of alcohol always clinging to him. Cheap whiskey. One night, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I heard the front door slam. Aaron stumbles in, movements heavy and uncoordinated. He muttered something under his breath, slurred and unintelligible, before disappearing up the stairs. I just sat there, unsure if I should say something or pretend I never saw anything. So I went with the latter, hoping this was just a one-off, but it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Aaron's late-night entrances became a pretty much regular thing. Sometimes I'd hear him arguing with somebody on the phone, voice rising in anger before cutting off abruptly. Other times I'd hear him pacing upstairs, floorboards groaning underneath his weight. The worst was the nights he didn't come home at all, leaving that house eerily silent. And those were the nights I started double-checking the locks on my door. One Friday night, while I was home making dinner, I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anybody, and Aaron didn't mention any visitors. When I opened it, I found two policemen standing on the front porch. Uniforms were neat, expressions unreadable. There was a tension in the air that made my stomach twist. "Is Aaron home?" one of them asked. I shook my head. "No, he's not here right now. What's going on? Can I help you?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before holding up a folded piece of paper. "We're here to serve an eviction notice. The property owner has not received rent payments in months. Are you aware of that?" I felt my heart drop into my stomach. No, I had no idea. I pay Aaron every month for my room. The officers nodded like they heard it all before. "Well, you might want to start looking for a new place. This house is going to be locked up in a few weeks. If you do see Aaron, let him know he needs to contact the property owner immediately." They left after that, leaving me just standing in the doorway with that notice in my hand. My mind was racing. Aaron hadn't paid the rent. How was that even possible? He had a good job, or at least he always said he did. What about his kids? Do they even know what's going on? I didn't see Aaron that night or the next. That eviction notice just sat upon the kitchen counter, a grim reminder of the ticking clock that was now hanging over my head. I knew I had to get out, and fast, so I started searching for places immediately, scouring classifieds, making phone calls during my lunch breaks. All the while, I kept those plans to myself. Aaron was unpredictable enough sober. I didn't want to find out what he'd do if he caught wind of me bailing on him. A week later, I did find a small studio apartment a few miles away. Not much, but it was clean and affordable. And that landlord seemed to be normal. I signed the lease and started packing that night, cramming my belongings into boxes as quietly as I could. Didn't want Aaron to hear me. Didn't want to risk any kind of confrontation. The day of the move, I waited until Aaron was at work. I'd seen his car pull out of the driveway that morning, and I knew I'd have at least a few hours before he got back. I loaded everything into my car in record time, heart pounding with every trip up and down those stairs. By the time I locked that front door behind me for the last time, I was drenched in sweat. I didn't look back as I drove away, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that Aaron was watching me, that he knew what I was doing. It was completely irrational. He wasn't even home, but that feeling stayed with me. A week later, I was fully settled into my new place, the tension of the few past months slowly starting to fade. I didn't think about Aaron too much after that, at least not until the night I drove past the old house. It was late. I just finished dinner with some friends. On a whim, I decided I'm gonna take the long way home, pass through the old neighborhood. That house looked exactly the same, peeling siding and overgrown lawn untouched by time. I noticed a man standing in the driveway, and for a split second I thought it was Aaron. But as I got closer, I realized it was one of the neighbors, a middle-aged guy that I'd spoken to a few times. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Hey, is Aaron still around?" The man just looked up at me. His face then lit up with recognition. "Hey, no, he's gone. Got evicted a few weeks ago. Haven't seen him since." I frowned. "Hey, do you know what happened?" The man just leaned up against my car, clearly eager to gossip. Word is, he had a gambling problem, big one. Lost a ton of money and racked up debts with some bad people. The guy was practically living at the casino downtown, betting on anything he could, horses, cards, fights, you name it. I heard he owed thousands by the time he finally got kicked out. "Where is he now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The man just shrugged. "Who knows? One morning the house was just empty. No furniture, no car, nothing. He must have skipped town. Either that or..." He trailed off, a grim look now on his face. "Or what?" The man then hesitated. "Or somebody found him before he could run away. Guys like that, they don't just get to walk away clean." I thanked him and drove off. Aaron had always been this enigma, but now he felt like a ghost, a lingering presence that just refused to fade. I thought about those late nights, the arguments on the phone, the eviction notice. It all painted a picture of a man unraveling, a man who had truly lost control of his life. I pulled into my new driveway. In the moment, I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see Aaron's car slowly following me, but the street was empty, silent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't all over, that Aaron's story was not finished yet. And maybe, just maybe, neither was mine. The neighbor's words stuck long with me after I got home. Aaron wasn't just a bad landlord or a guy down on his luck. He was a powder keg that had finally gone off. That thought chilled me, but it also felt like a warning, like I dodged a bullet getting out when I did. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I found myself checking the news, searching for any mention of his name, any indication of what might have happened to him. Nothing. It was like he vanished into thin air. No arrest, no mysterious bodies showing up in rivers, no whispers of loan sharks taking care of their debtors. Just nothing. It was pretty unsettling to say the least. Then one night it all came back to me. I should have never visited that neighborhood. It was late, sometime after midnight, and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone. My new apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the building settling or the hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen. I'd finally started to feel safe again, like my life was finally getting back to some form of normalcy. Then a soft, deliberate knock came at my front door. It was after midnight. Who the hell was that? I froze, the sound sending a jolt of fear through me. It wasn't a friendly knock either. It wasn't the kind of knock a neighbor might make if they needed to borrow some sugar or ask about a package. It was slow, deliberate, and far too patient. I lay there, perfectly still, phone still clutched in my hand. My heart was now pounding so loud I swore it was giving me away. A knock came once more, this time a little harder. 3 slow, steady thuds. I didn't move. Whoever was out there didn't call out. They didn't announce themselves. They just stood there, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I waited, barely daring to even take a breath, straining to hear any sound from the other side of my door. But there was nothing. I forced myself to sit up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay put, but I had to know. I crept out of bed, careful to avoid the spots in the floor that would creak, and made my way to the front door. There was no peephole, just a flimsy chain lock and a cheap deadbolt that suddenly felt laughably inadequate. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for any more signs of movement. And then, in a voice that made my blood run cold, I heard it. "Hey, it's Aaron. Open up." My heart stopped. It wasn't just the fact that he was here, at my door, in the middle of the night. It was the way he said it, like we were old friends, like nothing happened. His voice was calm, almost cheerful. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "Come on, man," he said. "I just want to talk." I took a step back, legs shaking. How did he find me? How long had he been out there, watching, waiting? He had to have followed me. When I didn't answer, he knocked again, harder. The door rattled in its frame, and I could hear his breathing now. "You think you can just run off? Leave me to deal with all of this?" He snarled. "You don't think I don't know what you've been saying about me?" My mind raced. Saying about him? What the hell is this guy talking about? I hadn't said anything to anybody, not even that neighbor. "I trusted you," he shouted, his voice raw and filled with venom now. "You don't just walk away from me. You don't get to do that." I stumbled back, foot catching on the edge of the rug, and fell down hard. The sound must have been loud enough for him to hear, because the next thing I knew, he was slamming his fists against the door. "Open the damn door! You killed me. You ruined my life. You took everything from me." The chain rattled violently, the frame groaning underneath the force of his blows. I scrambled to my feet, hands shaking as I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed 911.
911, what's your emergency?
"There's somebody at my door," I shouted. "He's trying to get in." The operator's voice was calm and methodical, and I barely even heard her instructions. My focus was on the door, the way it continued to shudder with every hit. I gave her all the information needed and did my best to just breathe.
"We have officers en route,"
she said.
"Just stay on the line with me, sir."
Then, the banging on the door stopped, and that silence was deafening. I stood there frozen, phone pressed to my ear, waiting for something, anything. Then I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, retreating down the hall. A few moments later, the officers arrived, but Aaron was long gone. Checked the building, took my statement, and promised to patrol the area for the next few nights, but I could tell by the way they looked at me that they didn't think he'd be back. I didn't have the money to move again, but thankfully, I never saw Aaron again, never heard from him. Whatever he was running from eventually must have caught up with him, right before he could take me down with him.